Uriel Kamael Birian decoded. Today's single line is simple, but the science behind it is anything but buos to yer Brainpower USI TA CMP is Audi Triske. What if I told you that in as little as 10 minutes, you can sharpen attention, strengthen working memory, and boost creative output, and that the mechanism is literally a change in blood flow and brain chemistry? Stay with me. Let me be blunt. We chase supplements, hacks, and long rituals because we underestimate the power of movement. The trick I'll teach you is not exotic. It's not an app or a pill. It's a short bout of aerobic exercise done intentionally before the work you want your brain to do. Walk, cycle, jog, or do a short, intense set of bodyweight moves. Done right, this single intervention makes your brain primed to learn and perform. The idea of a simple trick often feels misleading, especially when we're talking about changing something as complex as brain function. But in this case, simplicity is not just accurate, it's the entire mechanism. The brain is an organ that responds to state. If you shift your physiological state even slightly, the brain reorganizes its levels of alertness, focus, and readiness to learn. This is why the most potent cognitive enhancer available to nearly everyone is not a supplement or a device. It's the deliberate use of short, intentional bouts of physical movement before engaging in any mental task that requires heightened clarity or sustained attention. When you move your body at even a moderate intensity, the first thing that changes is your breathing. Breathing deepens and accelerates, which immediately alters the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in your bloodstream. This alone can shift the brain from a low arousal state into a more alert and perceptive one. But the real magic is deeper. Movement increases heart rate, which increases blood flow to the brain, delivering more glucose and oxygen precisely when neurons are about to demand it. Think of it as priming an engine before a high-performance task. A cold engine sputters. A warmed engine fires quickly and efficiently. As heart rate rises, the body also releases neuromodulators like norepinephrine and dopamine. These chemicals sharpen focus, bias the brain toward goal-directed behavior, and increase motivation. They essentially open the attentional gate, allowing you to lock onto a task more easily and resist distraction more effectively. This is why people consistently report that after a brief walk, a short jog, or even a few minutes of high-intensity intervals, their mind feels clearer and more organized. It isn't psychological in the vague sense. It's mechanical. It's chemistry. It's physiology aligning with intention. Another key element that movement taps into is BDNF, a growth-promoting molecule that supports plasticity, the brain's ability to learn and change. Short bouts of exercise elevate BDNF, making the neural circuits that encode new information more responsive. This means that if you study, write, plan, or create immediately after movement, your brain is literally in a state more prepared to retain and integrate information. Even a 10-minute brisk walk is enough to produce these effects, though a 20 to 30-minute session tends to amplify them and sustain them longer. What's particularly valuable is that these shifts don't require an athletic background or extreme effort. You aren't aiming for exhaustion, you're aiming for activation, a deliberate rise in heart rate and breathing that signals to your nervous system that something important is happening. That signal is ancient. Humans evolved to think most clearly when movement preceded cognition. For most of human history, you moved before you strategized, planned, hunted, navigated, or solved problems. The brain still carries that expectation. The timing matters. Doing the movement before the cognitive work creates a predictable, reliable arc of heightened alertness followed by focused calm. That second phase, focused calm, is where productivity becomes deeper and more sustainable. The brain is primed, but not jittery, alert, but not anxious. It's the zone in which mental effort feels rewarding rather than draining. If you want to apply this effectively, think small and repeatable. Choose a simple movement pattern, a brisk walk, a slow jog, cycling, jump rope, or a short bodyweight circuit. Do it for 10-20 minutes. Immediately afterward, sit down, take a few steady breaths, and begin the task you care about most. Over a few days, you'll start to notice that your ability to initiate focus improves. Over a few weeks, you'll notice that your baseline clarity and mood are better even on days you don't exercise beforehand. That's the compounding effect of repeated neural activation. The beauty of this simple trick is that it aligns biology with behavior. It doesn't require willpower, complex tracking apps, or major lifestyle changes. It requires honoring the fact that the brain performs as a function of the body. Movement isn't separate from thinking. It prepares the neural landscape for thinking. Once you feel that shift, the sense of mental brightness that follows deliberate movement. It becomes obvious why this practice works. And it becomes almost impossible to go back to starting your day, your work, or your learning in a low-energy, unprimed state. Movement is the switch. The brain is the beneficiary. Understanding why something works changes your relationship to it. When you know the underlying mechanism, you aren't relying on motivation or guesswork anymore. You're leveraging biology with precision. The reason this simple pre-task movement technique works so effectively is because it shifts the entire neurochemical landscape of the brain. It takes the brain from a low arousal, scattered baseline into a state of controlled readiness. That shift isn't subtle. It involves blood flow, neuromodulators, electrical activity, and the way neural circuits communicate with one another. When you begin moving, even at moderate intensity, your body immediately increases respiration and circulation. This rise in blood flow is the first domino. The brain, despite representing only a small percentage of total body mass, consumes a significant share of the body's glucose and oxygen. Short bouts of aerobic movement push more oxygenated blood into the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, regions responsible for attention, working memory, planning, and learning. The neurons in these regions fire more efficiently when their metabolic needs are met. They become better at sustaining activity over time, which is essential for focus and deep work. The second domino, and arguably the most important, is neuromodulation. Movement triggers the release of norepinephrine, dopamine, and, in certain intensities, epinephrine. These are not just feel-good molecules. They regulate signal-to-noise ratio in the brain. Signal-to-noise ratio refers to how effectively the brain can amplify the neural activity relevant to a task while suppressing irrelevant chatter. When norepinephrine levels rise, the brain enhances its ability to select what to pay attention to. Dopamine adds the motivational pull, the sense that the task is rewarding or meaningful. Together, these two chemicals create the foundation for sustained cognitive effort. Without them, the brain drifts. With them, it locks in. Another key mechanism involves brain oscillations, the coordinated rhythms of electrical activity. Light to moderate aerobic exercise increases beta activity associated with alert engagement, while also stabilizing alpha rhythms linked to calm, sustained attention. This unique combination, alert yet steady, is rare to achieve without movement. It's one of the reasons people often describe feeling clear or organized after a short workout. Their neural rhythms are literally synchronized for focus. Movement also interacts with the brain's stress system in a way that might seem counterintuitive. Exercise is technically a stressor, but it's a controlled one. A brief rise in cortisol and adrenaline acts like a calibration for the nervous system. Instead of pushing you into anxiety, it creates a window of sharpened vigilance. The sympathetic nervous system rises during the activity, but as soon as you stop, it drops into a more balanced state. That rebound shift places you into a cognitive sweet spot known as focused calm, high readiness without overstimulation. The mechanism that supports learning and creativity is different, but equally powerful. During aerobic movement, the body increases levels of BDNF, a molecule that supports synaptic growth and neuroplasticity. Plasticity is the process by which the brain strengthens old connections and forms new ones. When BDNF is elevated, the circuits involved in whatever you do next become more malleable and more likely to encode change. This is why performing exercise before learning or problem solving creates measurable improvements. The brain is simply more primed to absorb and transform information. There's also an important interaction with the default mode network, the set of brain regions active during mind wandering. Short bouts of movement reduce excessive default mode activity, making it easier to transition into task-directed states. This is what helps reduce rumination, overthinking, and mental clutter. Once the default mode quiets down, the networks responsible for attention and executive control can take the lead. You experience this as a shift from scattered thinking to directed thinking. On a deeper level, the mechanism is evolutionary. For thousands of years, humans engaged in physical movement before needing to solve problems, plan, navigate, or make decisions. The nervous system evolved with the expectation that movement precedes cognition. When you trigger that sequence, movement first, thinking second, you align with a biological blueprint that has been in place far longer than any modern approach to productivity. Put all of this together and the picture becomes clear. The reason this simple trick works is because it taps into fundamental principles of how the brain mobilizes resources. You raise blood flow, increase neuromodulators, quiet internal chatter, synchronize neural rhythms, open the gates of plasticity, and shift your state into one optimized for clarity and focus. You aren't forcing the brain to work harder, you're preparing it to work the way it's designed to. When you understand the mechanism, you stop seeing movement as optional. You start seeing it as the ignition key for mental performance. When discussing how to use movement to enhance brain function, dose and timing matter as much as the mechanism itself. The nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to intensity, duration, and the sequence in which states unfold. Applying movement randomly will still offer benefits, but applying it deliberately at the right level for the right amount of time, placed before the right cognitive demands, can amplify its effects dramatically. This is where small adjustments create meaningful differences in focus, learning, and mental endurance. The first concept to understand is that there is a minimum effective dose. You don't need long workouts to create substantial shifts in brain state. Even 10 minutes of continuous movement is enough to increase blood flow, raise neuromodulators, and transition the brain out of low arousal states. Those 10 minutes can serve as the neurological ignition sequence. But for many people, 10 minutes produces a short-lived effect. The clarity might last 30 to 60 minutes before tapering off. If your goal is a more extended period of deep focus, a slightly longer dose, around 20 minutes, tends to create a more stable arc of alertness. 20 to 30 minutes of moderate movement appears to hit the sweet spot for most individuals. The heart rate elevates enough to trigger norepinephrine, dopamine, and a meaningful bump in BDNF, but not so intensely that it produces fatigue or overstimulation afterward. At this duration, the cognitive benefits often last 1 to 3 hours, sometimes longer if paired with hydration and a brief cool down. The point of this duration is not physical conditioning. It's neurochemical conditioning, setting the stage for the work your brain needs to do next. Intensity is the next variable, and it needs to be calibrated. Moderate intensity is the standard recommendation because it reliably increases alertness without causing depletion. A good marker is whether you can speak a full sentence while moving. If you can talk, but not comfortably carry long conversations, you're likely in the right zone. This level strikes the balance between arousal and sustainability. Too low, and the brain doesn't receive the strong neurochemical signal. Too high, and the nervous system may enter a fatigued or jittery state that interferes with precision thinking. There is a different but equally effective approach: short bursts of high-intensity training. These don't need to be long. 2 to 4 minutes of hard intervals broken into 20, 40-second efforts can create a rapid spike in neuromodulators and lactate. That lactate, once viewed negatively, actually acts as a potent fuel source for neurons. In small doses, high-intensity bouts can create a sharper, more immediate lift in cognitive readiness. But they should be used intentionally. If the goal is creative thinking, problem-solving, or extended focus, a brief high-intensity session may be optimal. If the goal is calm, methodical concentration, moderate intensities are usually more reliable. Timing is the dimension where most people see the biggest performance shift. Doing movement before the cognitive task you care about is essential. This is when the brain is most receptive to the neuromodulators released during exercise. Your prefrontal cortex becomes more stable, your attention networks more selective, and your memory systems more plastic. Movement after the task is still beneficial for long-term health, but it doesn't provide the same immediate cognitive priming. There is also a rhythm across the day worth considering. Early day movement tends to set an elevated baseline of alertness that can last for hours. Midday movement can serve as a reset, especially when energy dips or concentration fades. Late day movement can be useful for mood and stress regulation, but it may not be ideal right before tasks requiring deep cognitive work, since the brain tends to prefer a more relaxed state in the evening. The transition time after movement matters too. Ending the exercise and immediately diving into work is possible, but most people benefit from a 3 to 5 minute cool down. Something as simple as steady nasal breathing, a glass of water, or a minute of sitting quietly can shift the sympathetic spike from movement into a more balanced but still alert state. This brief window is where the nervous system locks in the focused calm you're aiming for. Consistency amplifies everything. Using the same movement protocol at roughly the same time each day builds a predictable state shift. Over weeks, the brain begins to anticipate the pattern. Move gay, settle gay work becomes a conditioned loop. The nervous system learns the sequence, making the transition into focus faster and more efficient each time. This patterning is the reason even small doses can eventually generate big improvements. The right dose and timing are less about intensity and more about alignment, aligning the body's physiological peak with the brain's cognitive demand. When you find the dose that makes you feel clear but not wired, energized yet steady, that's your personalized window. And when you place that window before the tasks that matter most, you use biology the way it was designed, as a lever to unlock sharper, deeper, more sustainable mental performance. The real power of this method comes from putting it into practice in a way that's simple enough to repeat daily. Implementation matters more than intensity, and the goal is to make the shift from movement to focus feel natural rather than forced. When you treat movement as part of your cognitive routine instead of something separate from your mental work, the entire process becomes more automatic and more effective. The first step is selecting a mode of movement that feels accessible. It doesn't need to be athletic or intimidating. A brisk walk, a short jog, stationary cycling, light jumping rope, or even a simple bodyweight circuit can all produce the necessary state change. The choice should be based on what you're willing to do consistently. The nervous system responds to reliable patterns far more effectively than sporadic efforts. If you enjoy walking, use walking. If you prefer cycling, use cycling. If time is limited, use a brief interval-style routine. The movement itself is not the point. The state it creates is. Once you've chosen the movement, the next step is to attach it to the task that matters most. Think of it as the initiation ritual for your brain. Before any cognitively heavy work, studying, writing, strategic thinking, deep learning, perform your movement session. This pairing is crucial. Over time, your brain begins to anticipate that mental effort follows physical movement. That anticipation triggers a faster rise in alertness before the task even begins. This is how routines turn into neurological advantages. For many people, the easiest approach is what could be called a transition block. It looks simple: 10 to 20 minutes of movement, followed by 3 to 5 minutes of settling. During the settling period, slow your breathing and let your heart rate drift down naturally. You're not trying to calm yourself fully. You're shaping the arousal curve so that it peaks during movement and stabilizes into focused readiness immediately afterward. Something as small as a glass of water or a minute of nasal breathing strengthens that transition. These small cues act as markers that tell the nervous system one phase is ending and another is beginning. The next part of implementation is structure. It helps to designate a specific time in the day when you apply this protocol. Early morning works well for many people because baseline cortisol is already elevated, making it easier to shift into alertness. Combining that natural rise with movement amplifies the effect. But midday is also effective, especially if you're using movement as a reset to push through cognitive fatigue. What matters most is consistency, not the clock. Pick a time that aligns with when you do your best mental work and anchor the movement to that time. Environment influences implementation more than people realize. If you plan to walk, choose a route that's easy to access and doesn't require preparation. If you're doing bodyweight circuits, designate a space in your room or office where you can move without friction. Reducing barriers, like finding shoes, clearing space, or deciding where to go, removes mental resistance and makes the routine easier to follow. The smoother the setup, the more reliably your brain receives the real benefits. Another part of practicality is learning to adjust the movement dose based on the cognitive task ahead. If the task involves deep concentration, such as analyzing complex material or writing something precise, moderate intensity movement works best. It raises alertness without creating excess agitation. If the task requires creative thinking, brainstorming, or generating ideas, slightly higher fluctuations in intensity, like intervals, can spark more divergent thinking. You're essentially tuning your brain depending on the type of workload, the same way you might tune a camera depending on the environment. The final piece is tracking. Not formal tracking with apps or elaborate systems, but simple awareness. After applying this method for a week, notice when your focus feels strongest, how long the clarity lasts, and whether certain intensities or durations suit you better. Biology is universal, but personal responses are individual. The nervous system has patterns, but your routine should match your own rhythms. Over time, this awareness leads to a personalized protocol, something you can rely on regardless of motivation or mood. The beauty of this approach is that once you practiced it for a few weeks, it stops feeling like a technique and starts feeling like the natural beginning of cognitive work. Movement becomes the switch. The transition becomes the cue. Focus becomes the outcome. When implemented consistently and with a bit of intentionality, this simple practice can elevate productivity, deepen learning, and make the brain feel more cooperative rather than resistant. The key is not perfection, it's repetition. Small, reliable inputs shape the nervous system far more powerfully than occasional intense efforts. Once this becomes part of your routine, the benefits compound in ways that make the effort feel not just worthwhile, but essential. We chase complicated fixes, but sometimes the biggest leverage points are the simplest. Move your body, change your brain. 10 to 30 minutes of intentional aerobic activity, done before learning or focus work, is a neuroscience-backed, practical, and repeatable way to boost attention, memory, and creativity. Try the 7-day challenge. Notice the difference. Then make it a habit. If this experiment helps you, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what change you noticed. Was your focus deeper? Did ideas come easier? I'll read them and we'll refine the protocol together. Thank you for watching BRAI and Decoded E. Move first, think sharper, and I'll see you in the next video.